Some stories begin with a gunshot. Flint Ridge, Nebraska. 1886. Lucy Reed was on her knees in the middle of the saloon, one palm pressed against the rough boards, the other still gripping a leather case filled with the papers that might save her grain mill, her warehouse, and the last honest route to the railroad. A freight receipt, spotted with blood from her split lip, slid beneath Abram Vane's polished boot. He looked down at it, without bending. Outside, prairie wind scraped dust along the windows and rattled the iron sign above the door. Inside, no one spoke. Lucy raised her eyes toward the ranch hands, wheat farmers, freight men, and town officers who had watched Abram strike her. 39 men found something else to study. Their whiskey, their hands, the floor. Only moments before, Lucy had crossed the room alone, placed Ethan Reed's records on Abram's table, and told the most powerful landowner in Flint Ridge that she knew how he had been stealing from the farmers and what he had done to her husband. Abram had leaned close enough for only her to hear. Ethan begged longer than you did. Then he struck her. Now the papers lay scattered around her, like pieces of a life someone meant to erase. Louis did not cry. That was what made the silence uglier. She looked across the room and said 2 words so quietly, the piano player had to stop to hear them. Please help me. A chair moved in the darkest corner. The man seated there had spent 8 months teaching Flint Ridge not to notice him. Cal Mercer rose slowly, wearing a travel-stained coat and the stillness of a man who had survived by never giving anyone a reason to remember his face. Abram saw him and smiled, not because Cal was harmless, because Abram knew exactly who he was. Sit down, Mercer. The name crossed the room like a blade. Several men looked up at once. Cal Mercer, former deputy U.S. marshal, wanted in 2 counties for a train robbery he had never committed. Lucy stared at him from the floor. The only man willing to help her was a hunted man who could lose his freedom before he reached her side. Cal stepped away from the table. 3 of Abram's riders moved to meet him. His right hand slipped inside his coat. The piano wire hummed in the silence. Abram's smile widened. Then Cal drew out the one thing no one in that room expected to see. And for the first time that night, Abram Vane looked afraid. Some stories begin with a gunshot. Flint Ridge, Nebraska. Lucy Reed was on her knees in the middle of the saloon, one palm pressed against the rough boards, the other still gripping a leather case filled with the papers that might save her grain mill, her warehouse, and the last honest route to the railroad. A freight receipt, spotted with blood from her split lip, slid beneath Abram Vane's polished boot. He looked down at it, without bending. Outside, prairie wind scraped dust along the windows and rattled the iron sign above the door. Inside, no one spoke. Lucy raised her eyes toward the ranch hands, wheat farmers, freight men, and town officers who had watched Abram strike her. 39 men found something else to study. Their whiskey, their hands, the floor. Only moments before, Lucy had crossed the room alone, placed Ethan Reed's records on Abram's table, and told the most powerful landowner in Flint Ridge that she knew how he had been stealing from the farmers and what he had done to her husband. Abram had leaned close enough for only her to hear. Ethan begged longer than you did. Then he struck her. Now the papers lay scattered around her, like pieces of a life someone meant to erase. Lucy did not cry. That was what made the silence uglier. She looked across the room and said 2 words so quietly, the piano player had to stop to hear them. Please help me. A chair moved in the darkest corner. The man seated there had spent 8 months teaching Flint Ridge not to notice him. Cal Mercer rose slowly, wearing a travel-stained coat and the stillness of a man who had survived by never giving anyone a reason to remember his face. Abram saw him and smiled, not because Cal was harmless, because Abram knew exactly who he was. Sit down, Mercer. The name crossed the room like a blade. Several men looked up at once. Cal Mercer, former deputy U.S. marshal, wanted in 2 counties for a train robbery he had never committed. Lucy stared at him from the floor. The only man willing to help her was a hunted man who could lose his freedom before he reached her side. Cal stepped away from the table. 3 of Abram's riders moved to meet him, his right hand slipped inside his coat. The piano wire hummed in the silence. Abram's smile widened. Then Cal drew out the one thing no one in that room expected to see, and for the first time that night, Abram Vane looked afraid. The badge Abram thought was buried. It was not a pistol. It was an old deputy marshal's badge, dulled at the edges from years of being carried close and hidden from men who wanted it buried. Cal held it beneath the saloon lamp. The 3 riders stopped. So did Abram's smile. The badge gave Cal no clean authority in Flint Ridge. A warrant bearing his name still waited in 2 counties, and Abram could summon the sheriff with a single word. But killing a former federal lawman before 40 witnesses would bring questions from beyond the town. Questions Abram could not buy so easily. Cal looked at the papers around Lucy. Pick them up. One rider glanced toward Abram. Abram's eyes moved from the badge to Cal's face, measuring which danger would cost him more. Then he nodded. The men gathered Ethan Reed's freight receipts from the floor. Cal crossed the room and offered Lucy his hand. She looked at, then pushed herself upright without taking it. Blood touched the corner of her mouth, but her voice stayed level. I can walk. I can see that. He placed the papers inside her leather case. No one stopped them as they crossed the saloon. That frightened Cal more than a drawn gun would have. Abram Vane did not surrender ground. He gave it up only when he had already chosen where to strike next. Outside, prairie wind carried coal smoke from the rail yard. Lucy stood beneath the swinging sign until the dizziness passed. Then she turned to Cal. Who are you really? A man who has watched Abram Vane for 8 months. That badge says more than that. The warrant says something else. Lucy studied him in the yellow light from the windows. The only man who had stood for her was also the man Flint Ridge had been warned to fear. She tightened her grip on the case. Come with me. Reed Mill stood beyond the last houses, its wind tower black against the moonlit prairie. Inside, Lucy lit 2 oil lamps beside the gear housing. She washed the blood from her lip, while Cal held the lamp where she directed, careful not to touch her. Then she reached behind the wooden casing and drew out Ethan's hidden ledger. Cal opened it. Freight weights, delayed rail cars, land sales, notes on the broken pump mechanism, and one name repeated in Ethan's careful hand, Joe Wynn. At the bottom of the final page, Ethan had begun one last sentence. Joe saw them beneath the tower the night before. The rest of the page had been torn away. The man who entered the mill in darkness. Cal read Ethan's unfinished sentence twice. Then he turned through the ledger again, following the numbers instead of the words. Freight weights changed on the same days. Abram bought grain below market price. Rail cars disappeared from the loading schedule just before small farmers missed loan payments. Parcels changed hands after businesses failed in ways that looked accidental until the dates were placed together. Lucy stood across the work table with both hands flat on the wood. She watched Cal read the book her husband had died protecting, not like a widow, guarding a memory, like an owner, deciding whether the man before her could be trusted with the only weapon she had left. Cal opened his notebook. For 8 months, he had recorded the same pattern from the other side. Abram's riders visiting the depot after midnight. Cash passing through the sheriff's office. False freight claims signed by men who never saw the cargo. 2 separate trails had reached the same door. Lucy looked at the badge beside his hand. What happened to you? Cal did not soften the answer. 3 years earlier, Abram had paid a witness to place him near a robbed train and persuaded a county sheriff to sign the warrant. By the time Cal understood the trap, his name had already traveled farther than the truth. Lucy looked down at Ethan's ledger. Then he took your name the way he took Ethan's life. Before Cal could answer, metal struck metal above them. The wind tower groaned. Loy seized a lantern and crossed the mill. A linkage beneath the brake housing had worked loose. Cal reached for the ladder. Lucy caught his sleeve. You climb that without knowing the mechanism. You may bring the whole arm down. She climbed first. From below, Cal held the lantern and followed every instruction she gave. They worked without argument. Her hands knew the machine. His knew when to obey. When the linkage settled into place, the tower resumed its slow turning above them. They made a plan before dawn. Cal would find Joe Wynn. Luna would go to May Holt at the depot. The original ledger would remain hidden. Every page would be copied twice. At first light, Lucy found the door open. The lock had not been broken. Ethan's ledger was still in its hiding place, but a folded note waited on the work table. Sell by Friday, or Ethan Reed will be remembered as a thief, and you as a woman too unstable to own his property. Cal examined the untouched lock. Abram had not come for the ledger. I had come to prove he knew where it was. The people who had families to lose. Joe Wynn lived above a feed store in Flint Ridge. Cal found him loading sacks before sunrise, moving like a man who expected trouble behind him. When Cal mentioned Ethan Reed, Joe stopped working. I did not deny what he had seen. 2 of Abram's men had gone beneath the wind tower the night before the pump failed. Joe watched them remove the cover plate and work near the brake linkage. The next morning, Ethan climbed the tower to inspect the damage. He never came down alive. Cal asked for a signed statement. Joe looked toward the road leading to the house Abram owned. My wife and boys sleep under his roof. Cal understood. Joe was not protecting himself. I was protecting the people Abram could reach before court opened. How long to move them? 2 days. Cal wrote the name of a rancher 30 miles east and handed Joe the paper. He will take them in without questions. Joe studied him. You planned for witnesses. I planned for fear. Across town, Lucy entered the railroad depot carrying a flour ledger. May Holt sat behind the freight desk, copying figures from one book into another. Lucy placed Ethan's dates beside the shipping records. May read the first page and went pale. The delayed rail cars matched. So did the altered weights and every purchase Abram made after a farmer missed his note. May closed the office door. For 2 years, she had copied the original numbers before Abram's agent changed them. She took a bundle of pages from beneath a loose floorboard. I kept waiting for someone to ask. Lucy did not promise safety. She told May what Abram could do if she signed her name. May tied the pages with string. I have known the cost of silence longer than you have. By dusk, Lucy returned to Reed Mill with May's copies beneath her coat. A court clerk waited beside the warehouse. He handed her a sealed document and left without meeting her eyes. Abram had petitioned the county court to place the mill and grain store under temporary management. The complaint called Lucy unstable. It described the saloon assault as an unprovoked public outburst. It claimed a grieving widow could not be trusted with valuable property. Cal arrived as she finished reading. Hans saw the filing date. The petition had been prepared before Lucy entered the saloon. Abram had not lost his temper that night. He had built a trap. The hearing would begin in 72 hours. If Lucy lost, Abram would control the mill before the final grain shipment left Flint Ridge. 72 hours. Cal read the petition twice before setting it on the table. Every sentence had been chosen before Lucy entered the saloon. Her accusation against Abram was called irrational. Her refusal to sell the mill was described as evidence of poor judgment. Even the blood on her face had been turned into proof that she could not control herself. Lucy stood beside the stove with her arms folded. I wanted me to walk into that room. Cal nodded. I wanted witnesses to your anger, not to what caused it. The hearing would begin in 72 hours. If the county judge approved Abram's request, a court-appointed manager would take control of Reed Mill, the warehouse, and every grain receipt stored inside. By the time Lucy appealed, the final harvest would already belong to Abram's buyers. Cal spread Ethan's ledger beside May Holt's copied railroad records. The pattern was no longer hidden. Abram delayed rail cars until wheat prices fell. Farmers who could not ship sold cheaply to his agents. Those who borrowed against the next harvest lost their land when winter came. Reed Mill was the last place in Flint Ridge where grain could be weighed, stored, and recorded. Without Abram's hand in the book, Lucy looked toward the dark warehouse beyond the kitchen wall. That is why Ethan would not sell, and why Abram cannot let you keep it. For a while, neither spoke. The wind pressed against the boards. Cal tightened a loose drawer handle with the edge of his knife. Lucy placed coffee and bread in front of him, without asking whether he intended to stay. It was a small thing, but Cal had spent 3 years eating wherever no one expected him the next morning. Judge Ben Vale was the only man with enough authority to stop the local court. He had a reputation for refusing money, pressure, and convenient explanations. Cal prepared a summary of the evidence. Lucy copied the dates in her careful hand. Before dawn, a rider carried the packet east. They waited through one day and half of another. The windmill turned, the warehouse filled. The clock on the shelf kept cutting their time into smaller pieces. The rider returned with 36 hours remaining. Judge Vale was not at his office. I was traveling through eastern Nebraska, hearing cases in towns too small to keep a judge of their own. No one knew exactly where he was. Lucy looked at Cal. How do you find one man in half of Nebraska with 36 hours left? Cal reached for his coat. 35. The names they could no longer hide. Cal saddled his horse in the yard, while the eastern sky remained black. Lucy stood beneath the wind tower, with Ethan's ledger wrapped in oilcloth against her chest. The safest choice was still available to both of them. Lucy could sell Reed Mill, leave Flint Ridge, and keep whatever life Abram allowed her to carry away. Cal could take the copied evidence and disappear before the county sheriff learned where he was. Neither choice required courage, only surrender. Before Cal rode east, they went to the courthouse. The clerk behind the counter read Lucy's sworn objection and looked toward the closed door of the county judge. Lucy placed her hand on the final page. She signed her full name beneath accusations of freight fraud, altered weights, sabotage, and the deliberate destruction of Ethan's mill machinery. The pen paused only once. Then the ink touched paper again. Cal signed the statement beside hers, not the false name he had used while watching Abram. Cal Mercer. The name carried warrants in 2 counties. By noon, every lawman connected to Abram could know exactly where to find him. The clerk sanded the signatures. There was no taking them back. At Reed Mill, Cal divided the evidence. Who's kept Ethan's original ledger hidden behind the gear housing. Cal carried copies of May's records, Ethan's diagrams, and the first pages of Joe Wynn's statement. Lucy wrapped the packet in waxed cloth and tied it behind the saddle. Cal tested the knot. She pulled it tighter. You rushed it. I have 35 hours. You will have fewer if your evidence scatters across the prairie. Their eyes met. For one brief moment, the mill, the warrants, and the approaching hearing seemed farther away. Then Cal placed his boot in the stirrup. If Vale refuses, sell the mill and leave. Lucy checked the strap once more. If Vale refuses, you come back and tell me yourself. Cal could not promise that. The road held weather, hired riders, and 2 warrants Abram had already used once. Hunt gave her the only answer he could, a single nod. Then he rode east. Lucy watched until the prairie swallowed horse and rider together. When she could no longer hear the hoofbeats, she returned to the warehouse. A railroad employee was hammering a notice onto the door. No Reed grain accepted for shipment. Behind him, 6 loaded farm wagons waited along the road. More were coming over the ridge. Abram had not waited for the hearing. He had already begun starving the mill. When the railroad closed a town, by noon, the road outside, Reed Mill had become a line of wagons. Wheat sacks rose above the boards, pale with dust, each load representing a family's winter money. Lucy stood beneath Abram's notice, while the farmers waited for her to tell them what to do. She did not. The grain belonged to them, so did the risk. Abram's buyers arrived before sunset with cash boxes and contracts already prepared. They offered less than half the week's market price. One farmer reached for a pen. Lucy opened Ethan's weight book beside him. She showed him what his wagon carried, what Abram would pay, and how much land the difference could cost by spring. The farmer put the pen down. Others did not. Lucy watched 2 wagons turn toward Abram's warehouse. She did not call the men cowards. Hunger made its own laws. Reed Mill could store only part of the harvest. If the railroad refused every Reed receipt, grain would spoil before the first hard snow. May Holt arrived after dark, with the depot copies hidden beneath her coat. Joe Wynn came an hour later. His wife and sons were safely east of Flint Ridge. He placed a signed statement on Lucy's work table. Then the three of them copied Ethan's ledger by lamplight. One cassette went beneath the gear housing, one inside a flour barrel, one with May. Abram could steal a book. He could not erase a truth carried by several hands. Far to the east, Cal rode beneath a sky without shelter. At every farm and relay stop, he asked the same careful questions. Had a judge's party passed through? Were they carrying court boxes? Had anyone heard of a land hearing scheduled nearby? Near dawn, a ranch woman remembered a gray-haired judge bound for Flat Rock. Cal changed direction and rode southeast. By the time he reached the town, his horse was lathered and his eyes burned from prairie dust. Judge Ben Vale was hearing a boundary dispute inside a crowded hall. Cal entered quietly and sat at the rear. He had crossed half a state to find the man. Now he had to wait while the clock kept moving. Back at Reed Mill, wheels sounded on the road before sunrise. A court-appointed manager stepped down beside two local officers. He carried an inventory book and an order authorizing him to take possession. Lucy closed Ethan's ledger. Then she walked to the warehouse door and stood in front of it. 2 hours to trust the law again. The court manager held out the order. Lucy took it without stepping aside. She read every line beneath the pale morning sky. The document allowed an inventory. It did not allow Abram's men to remove grain before the hearing. Lucy pointed to the wagons. The family marks burned into the boards, and the names written beside in every weight. If you count one sack, you write whose winter you are counting. The manager looked toward the local officers. Neither wanted to drag a widow away, while farmers watched from the road. May opened the depot books. Joe stood beside the warehouse with his signed statement visible in his hand. Lucy made the manager record each owner, each weight, and each seal. What Abram expected to take in an hour became a slow procession of names he could not easily bury. In Flat Rock, the hearing ended at last. Judge Ben Vale was in his late 60s, spare and gray, with the still attention of a man who had spent 30 years listening for the part people left out. Cal asked for 20 minutes. Vale gave him 20. At 7 that evening, Cal laid the evidence across a hotel table. Ethan's copied ledger, May's freight records, Joe's statement, Abram's petition against Lucy, and the warrants bearing Cal Mercer's name. Cal did not ask to be believed. He arranged the pages by date and let the pattern speak. When Vale reached the train robbery file, Cal removed his revolver, placed it beside the old badge, and pushed both across the table. If those warrants are lawful, I will be here when you finish. Vale studied him once, then returned to the papers. For 2 hours, the only sounds were a pen scratching and wagon wheels passing below the window. Cal sat near the door. He thought of Lucy facing Abram's court without him, of the warehouse filling beyond capacity, of the knot she had retied behind his saddle. For 3 years, he had survived by leaving before trust became dangerous. Now his freedom rested with a judge he had never met, and a woman holding the original proof of who he had been. At 9 o'clock, Vale closed the final ledger and put on his coat. I ride tonight, before dawn. 2 horses and a court wagon crossed the last ridge above Flint Ridge. The wind tower appeared against the dark horizon. On the road below, another carriage was already moving toward Reed Mill. Cal recognized Abram Vane's team. Abram was going there before the court could stop him. The price Ethan already paid. Judge Vale reached the courthouse before Flint Ridge had fully awakened. By 8 o'clock, he had signed an emergency stay against the seizure of Reed Mill, an order preserving every railroad record tied to Abram Vane, and a warrant supported by the sworn statements of Lucy, May, Joe, and Cal. Because the local sheriff had helped Abram for years, Vale sent for a sheriff from the neighboring county. Cal did not ride ahead. He entered Flint Ridge beside the judge, not as a lawman reclaiming authority, but as a hunted man, placing himself beneath it. At Reed Mill, Lucy heard Abram's carriage before she saw it. He arrived with 2 riders, and none of the polished patience he had worn in the saloon. The wind had risen. Dust moved beneath the warehouse doors. Behind Lucy, May and Joe waited near the copying table, with the original ledger hidden beyond Abram's reach. Abram stepped inside. Name your price. Lucy looked past him toward the grain wagons still lined along the road. My price for what? The mill. The ledger. Your silence. For the first time, Abram's voice showed strain. I told her every business had a number, and every lonely person eventually learned to accept one. Lucy stood beside the gear housing Ethan had built. The scar on her lip had darkened. Her hands did not shake. Ethan already paid your price. She reached for the warehouse latch. You do not get to name another. The doors opened. Judge Ben Vale stood in the yard. Cal was beside him. So were the neighboring sheriff and the farmers. Abram had expected to frighten into leaving. Miss stepped forward with the depot books. Joe held his signed statement in both hands. Abram turned toward his riders. Neither man reached for a weapon. There were too many witnesses now. Too many copies. Too many names spoken aloud. The sheriff read the warrant. Abram did not run. Men like him rarely did. Running required admitting the world no longer obeyed them. The cuffs closed around his wrists inside the mill he had tried to steal. Luty looked at Cal. For one breath, the danger seemed finished. Then the sheriff unfolded a second paper. Cal Mercer's name was printed across the top. The old train robbery warrant had not yet been canceled. Cal removed his revolver and handed it over. Lucy took one step toward him. He stopped her with a look. The wagon door shut between them. Judge Vale watched it leave. The mill is safe for now. He looked toward the dust carrying Cal away. His name is not. The wind still turned at dawn. The hearing began 3 days later. Flint Ridge had spent too many years learning silence to become brave overnight. Lucy testified first. She described the altered freight weights, delayed rail cars, broken brake linkage, and the warning Abram left inside Reed Mill. She spoke Ethan's name without letting grief turn it into weakness. Ma followed with the depot books. Her copied figures matched every date in Ethan's ledger. Joe identified the men beneath the tower and explained why he stayed silent until his family was beyond Abram's reach. Then Ajuveld opened the train robbery file against Cal. The paid witness had placed Cal inside a freight car that did not reach the county until the next day. The shipping slips carried the same altered handwriting found in Abram's grain records. The sheriff who signed the warrant could not explain the missing pages in his own ledger. By noon, the case against Cal had collapsed. Judge Vale ordered the warrant withdrawn and sent notice to the second county. Abram was transferred east to await trial. The Flint Ridge sheriff resigned before sunset. The railroad restored Reed Mill's shipping access under court supervision, but victory did not return what had been taken. Ethan remained buried beneath the cottonwoods. Several farmers had already sold their land. Cal had lost 3 years to a lie. No ruling could give back. The next morning, Lucy found him saddling his horse in the mill yard. He still had to clear the record in person. She did not ask him to stay. I did not promise that he would. The north wind moved through the tower, turning the blades in circles. Lucy stopped a few feet from him. How did you find Judge Vale? Cal tightened the cinch. I asked the right people the right questions. He placed one boot in the stirrup. Lucy looked toward the mill. The north bearing will not last the first snow. Cal followed her gaze to the turning shaft. Then he looked back at her. Keep the wrench where I can find it. He demoguanted and rode beyond the warehouse. Lucy watched until the prairie took him from sight. Then she opened Reed Mill. The first rail cars moved beside the loading platform. Farmers brought in what grain they had saved. No one spoke about the 40 men who had looked away in the saloon. They did not need to. The memory remained in Flint Ridge, like an old nail beneath a floorboard. Behind Lucy, the wind kept turning Ethan's machinery. Ahead of her, Cal's road ran east. For the first time, it did not feel like a road that ended there. Thank you for staying with Lucy and Cal to the end of this journey. Their story reminds us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to stand when silence would be easier. If this tale of justice, sacrifice, and a second chance on the Nebraska frontier stayed with you, please subscribe and turn on notifications for more Western romance and frontier survival stories. And tell us in the comments, would you have stood up in that saloon or looked away like the others? Disclaimer, this is a fictional Western romance story inspired by life on the 19th century American frontier. Characters, events, Dialogue and dramatic situations are created for storytelling purposes. Historical settings and cultural details are researched for authenticity.